Hello, everybody. Sunday Adelaja here. I want to continue our yes, I want to continue our series that we have been doing today, which is the about African people, Black people. So the series is called "Black African People Cursed." No, they are not cursed. And by the time you understand the topic of today, you will discover that they are not cursed. So the topic of today is African influence on Western European civilization. African influence on Western European civilization. So Africans are a blessing. So I did part one of this yesterday. I did part one of this yesterday. Only I called it. I think I called it African. Something like anyway. This is the second part. So I'm going to start by talking about Dumas, with the general, not the writer this time, but the general. Yeah, so Dumas, an outstanding family of African French origin. Thomas Alexander Dumas, that was born 1762 and died 1806, later a French general, was a son of a black slave of African descent, Marie Cassette Dumas, and French Marquis David de la Pelleterie. When Thomas Alexandre decided to enlist in the Royal Guard as a simple soldier, his father, the Marquis, was strictly against his son tarnishing the family name by serving in the army. As a result, Thomas Alexander took only his second name and the name of his mother. So, under the name Alexander Dumas, he entered into the regiment of Queen Marie Antoinette as a dragoon. In the regiment, he quickly became famous for his Herculean exploits. It is reported that no one except him could clamp a horse on its sides, and by grabbing a stable beam, wood, pulled himself up with the horse. No one except him could put his four fingers in four rifles at the same time, in four rifle barrels, and carry all four rifles on an outstretched arm. This, this athlete read Caesar and Plutarch, but was recruited under a common name, and it took a revolution to make him an officer. During the revolution, Dumas built a highly successful military career. He was a corporal, lieutenant colonel, brigadier, and division general. With only a few people in his squad, he captured Masena, where Austrians were sitting on a sheer cliff. After getting to the top, his men stopped before a palisade of the enemy, not knowing how to overcome it. Then General Dumas shouted, "Let me through," and grabbing his soldiers by their pants, threw them through the palisade, the barricade of the enemies, directly at the terror-struck enemy. Napoleon appointed Dumas a commander of the cavalry, and in a short time, they became close friends. Dumas himself was worth a whole squadron. His legendary exploits may seem unbelievable, but still, they are not unimaginary. They are not imaginary. From Bonaparte's letters, we learn that General Dumas personally recaptured 6 flags from a numerically superior enemy, that skillfully interrogating a spy, he found out the plans of Austrians, that under Mantua, he stopped Wurmser's army. In this particular battle, he changed his wounded horses twice. Austrians called him Black Devil. Surely devil, because they couldn't believe the exploit he was doing. General Thibault who served with him described him this way. There was another divisional general serving under General Masena, a mulatto by the name of Dumas, a man who is very capable and moreover one of the most courageous, most powerful, and most nimble people I have ever seen. He was extraordinarily popular in the army, and everyone was talking about his chivalry and incredible physical strength. During the march from Alexandria to Cairo during the Egyptian campaign, there was an unsuccessful French attempt to conquer Egypt, and Levon, in which the commander of the French cavalry, Dumas, negatively commented on Napoleon's expedition and apparently assessed Bonaparte's qualities as the commander-in-chief of the campaign. He said something bad about Napoleon. He then demanded to be transferred back to France. The request was granted, and he left Egypt on an old boat, which had to be put aground in the southern part of the Italy kingdom of Naples, where he was taken prisoner and thrown into a dungeon. His former friend, Napoleon, which was the Emperor of France, did not make a single attempt to rescue him from there. In prison, they tried to poison him several times, and only after his health was broken was he released. Sick, Dumas died at the age of 43. The name Thomas Alexander Dumas is engraved on the southern wall of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. That's the most important arc monument in Paris, in France, and his name is there. It's engraved on the southern wall of it as one of the most important generals, and that's a monument for him. In 2009, a monument of General Dumas was opened at General Castro Square in Paris. The monument is called fers, shackles, fetters, and has a form of slave shackles more than 5 meters high and weighing several tons. Yeah, because he was a former slave, a slave that is free. Let us now learn about astonishing result of his son, Alexander Dumas. He had a son called Alexander Dumas. He became a playwright, journalist, and one of the most renowned French authors in the world, whose best-known characters were inspired by the life of his father, General Dumas. Due to the fact that Alexander Dumas' son was also named Alexander, he was called Alexander Dumas Père to distinguish him from his son. Because the family was left without any means of existence after the death of Thomas Alexander, Alexander received education by his own effort by reading a lot. After moving to Paris, during the first 6 years of his life there, without any money, literary ties, and finally without a systematic education, he became famous and was accepted as an equal in the circle of great writers of Romanticism. Victor Hugo, Alexander de Vigny, Béranger, and Charles Nodier, who became his patron. He published historical and adventure novels in newspapers, which made him a globally renowned writer. The Three Musketeers, everybody knows the Three Musketeers, 2 sequels, 20 years after, and the Vicomte de Bragelonne, or 10 years later, the Count of Monte Cristo, Queen Margot, La Dame de Montsoreau, the 2 Dianas, the 45 Guardsmen. The writer's literary heritage is astonishing. A complete collection of his works includes more than 1,000 volumes. So far, no one has been able to displace him from the first place in the list of world's most prolific literary figures in the world. 1,000 books. He even wrote a classical cooking book. So diverse were his interests and abilities. His works have been translated into 100 languages, and about 200 films have been made based on his novel. Okay, Alexander Dumas père was a quadrant. This term was used for people whose one ancestor in the second generation belonged to the Negroid race. He was very proud of his African root. One day, he answered to an ill-wisher trying to hurt him. His response to racism: my father was a mulatto, my grandfather was a Negro, and my great-grandfather a monkey. You see, sir, my family starts where yours ends. He said that after he had discovered that he was of African descent, he decided to act so that people could see what was under his skin. Historian Dudon Gnabanku describes a situation when Alexander Dumas père sat in the front row in the Versailles during a performance of African-American era Aldrich, who had a white temperament. His role was Shakespeare's Othello. In the final scene, he became so tense that his mouth was foamy and his eyes became bloodshot. This time, impressed by Aldrich's excellent performance, Alexander jumped on the stage, hugged him, and said, "I am a Negro too." In another case, when his daughter was getting married to a member of an aristocratic family, he invited many Africans from Paris. The groom's mother was shocked. He did not stop there and said, "They are my relatives who also want to be present." In 2002, 132 years after his death, he was reburied at the Pantheon of Paris, at the entrance to which the inscription reads, "To great men from a grateful fatherland." Wow. To a great man from a grateful fatherland. President Jacques Chirac, while acknowledging that racism existed in France, noted that the reburial was a correction of misconduct. They had to rebury him in the place of honor because he's the most famous writer they have. But they bury him like ordinary person before. But now the fatherland of France is now saying they are grateful, from a grateful fatherland to a great man. Very touching. So Chirac corrected the error, the racism, and said that it was through the reburial correcting the misconduct. The son of Alexander Dumas père was Alexander Dumas Fils, a playwright also and writer. He was elected an honorary member of French Academy, which was the highest intellectual recognition of a Frenchman. He was also decorated with the Legion of Honor, belonging to the order is the highest mark of distinction, honor, and official recognition of special merit in France. Despite his well-known name and his famous father, Alexander Dumas Fils found the power to break out of the glory of his parent and made his own name. Thanks to honesty, openness, and closeness to the people, Dumas Fils acquired world fame, which is still not inferior in any way to great artistic figures of France, whose works have been successful throughout the world. He became an innovator in the transition from romantic to realistic drama and was not afraid to ridicule social problems in his works or even to offer their solution. As we have seen, this family of African descent had an unbelievable impact on the development of France and the world culture in general. 3 generations. There were both phenomenal physical abilities and an intelligent leap of centennial proportions. They were both phenomenal. Anyway, I don't know how that is there. Or they had both phenomenal physical abilities and an intelligent leap of centennial proportions. Okay, let's go to another one now. This is from England. Johnblanca, a black musician in the entourage of an English king. African Johnblanca was one of the most famous musicians in the early 16th century and a famous excellent trumpeter at the court of King Henry VIII. In fact, he served as a staff musician at the court of Henry VIII and Henry VII and Henry VIII, where he was paid 8 pence a day. In accounting records of the royal court, there are records of monthly salary payments in pounds sterling to Johnblanca, a black trumpeter. He was praised the most after participating in a prestigious Westminster tournament of 1511, one of the most impressive and expensive spectacles of the time. A tournament stroll, which was dedicated to the birth of the king's son and is stored at the Era's College, twice depicts Johnblanca as one of the 6 trumpeters in the royal entourage mounted on a horse. Note that he wasn't just a musician. The quality of his game was worthy of the royal entourage. This black man was chosen from the entire population of England. And let's talk about another black man, which I'm excited about. This is a Nigerian of Igbo extract. He's an Igbo man that was a slave, and I'm going to show a video after, and the video is going to be about him. Olaudah Equiano, a visionary of the movement for abolition of slavery in Great Britain. Olaudah Equiano, known in his lifetime as Gustavus Vassa, was one of the most famous fighters for abolition of slavery in Britain in the 18th century. Originally, he was from the Nigerian Igbo people. A slave in his youth, he later bought his freedom, was a sailor and a merchant in South and North America, as well as in the Arctic. As a distinguished writer, even during the American Revolution, he wrote letters to Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who was the wife of King George III of England and grandmother of Queen Victoria. His autobiography that realistically depicted the horrors of slavery influenced the views of his contemporaries. Shortly after his death, the Slave Trade Act was passed in 1807. This is his work, the book that he wrote, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, the African, written by himself. That's his book right there. As a result of the adoption of this act, the United Kingdom pressurized other countries to stop slave trade, in particular the transatlantic slave trade of the United States was banned the same month. Also, due to the adoption of the act facilitated by Olaudah Equiano, slave trade was banned in Portugal, France, Holland, Sweden, and Spain. This African is venerated in the Church of England, and every year on July 30th, he is honored for his efforts in abolishing slavery and slave trade, together with William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson. The study of his life and achievements is included in the British national curriculum. In this African, we see a true history maker. Make notice of how global his impact on life of the Western world was. We can say that he has directly determined the state of a harmonious Western society that exists today. Wow. So if you are going to look at all these teachings, you will see that, the black people, they cannot be inferior or cursed and have all this influence on the highest level of European culture and civilization. So I want to encourage you to go and share the message. Let's share it. Share. And if you want to join our mentorship program, go to sundayadelajahblog.com/mentorship. If you want to get my books, go to sundayadelajahblog.com/books. If you want to come for History Makers training, go to sunlightelijahblog.com/HMT. If you want to go to Africa with us to build a better Africa, go to sunlightelijahblog.com/Nigeria. So thank you so much. We'll continue this teaching tomorrow. Peace. Video.
In the year 1745, in the town of Isaka in the district of Ibo, within the kingdom of Benin, in present-day eastern Nigeria, a child by the name of Olaudah Equiano was born. Olaudah, in the Ibo people's native language, signifies vicissitude or fortune, also one favored in having a loud voice and well-spoken, unbelievably describing what his life would be like, one filled with fortune in the face of numerous evils. Equiano grew up in a remote yet fertile and rich land of dancers, musicians, and poets. Major events were usually celebrated with these. The lifestyle of the Igbo people was simple, and everyone dressed the same. Convenience was valued over ornament, and wants were few and easily supplied. They valued marriage and hygiene greatly, and believed in one creator of all things. As well, since many of them were involved in labor from young ages, regardless of gender, they were greatly sought after by European slave traders. Olaudah was the youngest of his siblings and the favorite of his mother. His father was a village leader and owner of slaves himself, and from a young age he was trained in the art of war. His future seemed to be a prosperous one as he came from a successful family and was most likely to be a leader in his community, following in his father's footsteps. However, everything changed when at age 11, while the elders worked, and him and his sister stayed home alone, two men and a woman captured them and took them into the woods. Like prisoners, they tied their hands together and they walked on, stopping a few places at a time, until him and his sister were finally split up. This brought immense sorrow to Olaudah, who was only a young boy. Despite this, he was kept days and months traveling, jumping from one master's home to another. However, many were kind to him. He kept going this way from master to master until, in the middle of the night, he was taken away. They were taking him to the coast. And they traveled for 6 or 7 months, sometimes by land and sometimes by water, through different countries, kingdoms, and nations until they finally got there. The first things he noticed were the sea and the slave ship. He was amazed, but the feeling quickly turned into terror when he was taken in. In his narrative, he describes the atmosphere in the ship as so. The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate, added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration, from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs, into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror almost inconceivable. The ship took them to Bridgetown, on the island of Barbados, to be bought. But nobody bought Equiano, so he was boarded on the ship again, with all the unsaleable slaves, and was taken to the colony of Virginia in the United States. There he was bought by a Mr. Campbell, but he was soon bought again by a friend of Mr. Campbell's, who liked Olaudah very much, and wanted to take him back to England as a present for his friends. His name was Michael Henry Pascal, and he was a lieutenant of the Royal Army, who also happened to own a trading ship. Olaudah was taken on Pascal's trading ship full of crops, which was more comfortable than the horrendous slave ships. There he changed his name to Gustavus Vasa, what he became mostly known as for the rest of his life. And he met Richard Baker, a white, educated American who would become his friend, companion, interpreter, and teacher for the next 2 years. On the spring of 1757, they reached England. 12-year-old Olaudah marveled at the sight of snow, thinking that it was salt at first, and was taken to church for the first time. He was also surprised at the differences in customs between the Europeans and his people. A little after their arrival in England, his master took him and Richard to the island of Guernsey, where they would stay with a family, who treated them as part of their own. By the summer of 1757, they had left Guernsey and returned to England. Pascal had been assigned on the warship HMS Roebuck, which fought the French in Canada over control of territories. Young Olaudah was taken with the master on this trip. He witnessed attacks and deaths on both sides, and in 1978, he was present at the siege of Louisbourg in Nova Scotia. After spending most of his time at sea, he was sent to London, where shortly after arriving, his master ordered him to wait on the Miss Garretts, who were 2 sisters. They treated him kindly and sent him to school, so that he could learn to read and write. While he was with them, he also became baptized in 1759 at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster, although Pascal was hesitant to allow this at first. Eventually, Olaudah left them because an expedition had begun for the Mediterranean on a boat named the Namur. On the ship, Pascal told him to inquire about his friend Richard, as he had been assigned to another ship and Olaudah had not seen him since. Here he found out of his death, which deeply affected him. While still on the Namur, he also became involved in battles between the British and the French, as the French attacked their ship. He got himself in impossible situations, and despite getting into these situations, he always seemed to be one to survive unscathed. Instances like these shaped his belief that he was being protected. After their encounter with the French, the British retreated, but after Pascal had recovered, him and Olaudah boarded once more on another ship, the Aetna. Here, Equiano was a steward, and he enjoyed this job, as it allowed him time to learn important skills and improve his reading and writing. On November 1762, there were finally talks of peace, and their boat returned to England. At this time, his thoughts of freedom and desires to read and write grew. Pascal, threatened by these ideas of freedom, betrayed him by selling him to a Captain Doran, and although Olaudah refused, saying that it was illegal to sell a baptized man, it was no use, and he was sold and taken to the West Indies to serve for a Mr. King. He soon realized that he had landed in one of the best hands in the West Indies. Mr. King was a great master, and this was made even more clear when he began to be a witness to all the horrors around him. Other masters took advantage of women and young girls. They abused their slaves and treated them like savages. They had no care for their conditions or health, and they only cared for the work they could get from them. One day, Captain Thomas Farmer, the captain of one of Mr. King's ships, let Mr. King know of the challenges of the trip due to the irresponsible crew who was always drinking and rarely doing any of the actual work. The captain had taken a particular liking to Olaudah, so he asked Mr. King to let him work on board. After hesitantly allowing him to be part of the crew a few times, Olaudah decided to become a permanent member. While he traveled with the captain, his thoughts of freedom grew until he was thinking about it constantly. One day, his master called for him to tell him that he meant to sell him, because he had been made aware that he planned to run away. This was not entirely true, as Equiano would never actually betray Mr. King like that. With the help of the captain, he convinced Mr. King that this information was false, as Equiano had had plenty of opportunities, but he had never taken them. In turn, Mr. King then offered Olaudah his freedom. If he could pay him back the 40 shillings that he had paid for him initially, he would be free. Finally, at 21 years old, through a small personal trading business that he had created, Olaudah got the money to pay him. And although hesitant at first, with the help of the kind captain, Mr. King again accepted, and in the year 1766, Olaudah Equiano bought his freedom. The captain died a few months later, and if he had not survived to help with Equiano's freedom, he may have not even gotten it at all. This was something he credited to his believed celestial protection. Although he was now a free man, he stayed working for Mr. King for a while. But his life as a freed slave in the West Indies was a dangerous one with no security or protection. So, he returned to England. For a while, he worked as a hairdresser, but he was struggling for money, so he returned to the seas. Although this was good at first, when he was to return and make his trip back to England alone, he encountered some trouble. He was tricked onto a ship and almost sold back into slavery. However, by pure chance and luck alone, he was saved by a man who knew his friend, and he was soon again freed. In the end, in January of 1777, he returned to England. Here, he became involved in the anti-slavery movement as an active abolitionist. He lectured against the cruelty of the British slave owners, spoke out against the slave trade, and worked to resettle freed slaves, specifically in Sierra Leone, a British colony. In 1789, he published his narrative, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa the African. It became a bestseller in England and became considered the originator of the slave narrative. In 1972, he was married to a white woman named Susanna Cullen, which was almost unheard of at the time, as interracial marriages were very scandalous occurrences. He was also believed to have 2 daughters, Anna and Maria. His wife passed away in 1796, and he died a year later in London on March 31st at the age of 52 years old. In the last pages of his narrative, he wrote, "Tortures, murder, and every other imaginable barbarity and iniquity are practiced upon the poor slaves with impunity. I hope the slave trade will be abolished." Little did he know that in 1797, 10 years after his death, his wish was going to come true, and the English slave trade was going to be abolished.